This story goes back years, when Chuck E. Cheese still had that creepy animatronic band. I think they were called the Pizza Time Players or something like that. Well, anyways, I was a busboy there in college, and you wouldn't believe how gross some of those places are. On a few different occasions at my location, I found heroin needles, used condoms, and even dirty diapers shoved behind arcade machines. Yeah, it was pretty shady. Now that I've set the stage for you as to what kind of place this was, let me get back to how I was quarantined that night. I was working an afternoon shift and everything seemed fairly normal at first. There was a steady flow of families coming in and out, and honestly, none of them really made a whole lot of mess. I was definitely alright with working less, so I went over and hung out by the animatronic band and watched the show for a while. Not surprisingly, our animatronics were really run down. It was pretty funny. One of them would glitch constantly, and the lower portion of the dog Jasper T. Jowl's mouth was completely broken. As I watched them wobble around and shake, I saw a guy pull up outside in a dark 1950s Oldsmobile, which if you don't know what that looks like, let's just say it's a car that would definitely get people's attention in the 90s. The man inside it had this lurch-like funeral director look to him, with a suit and shiny balding head. The odd thing was, once he pulled up, he just sat out there in the car, staring into the establishment, until the animatronic show ended. Then he stepped out of the car with a toolbox and paperback novel in his hand. He walked slowly toward the front door and came into the restaurant. Once inside, I finally noticed how tall he was. He must have been at least 6'5", and the hostess Kim just kind of stared at him speechless. He was definitely a commanding presence. He held up some sort of badge for her to look at, and pointed to the animatronics at the back of the restaurant, to which she nodded quickly and allowed him entry. Walking past me without saying a word, he got behind this goofy chef animatronic. I assumed he must have been the animatronic's owner or something, because he just opened up his toolbox and started working on it. It was strange though, he kept looking down at his novel while he was working on it. Normally I would think he was reading instructions, but he was clearly just reading a book. I guess it's nice to be your own boss. I went about my business bussing the tables and didn't think much of it, but he definitely gave me a weird vibe. After he worked on them for a few minutes, the band perked up, as if preparing to do another show. But it wasn't the same as before. He had programmed a new sequence or something. It was really slow, there wasn't any music, and the band just looked around, awkwardly in silence. The funeral director, I guess we'll call him, closed his toolbox and headed back to the front of the restaurant. He then made this creepy grin and winked at me. So let's just say I was pretty glad he was leaving. The band just looked around for another 2 minutes or so, quietly. People in the restaurant started becoming really uncomfortable. Then this disturbing bird lady animatronic looked over at a child and just screamed. At that point, I had to find out what was going on. So I walked over to Kim and asked if the repair guy had said anything to her about the animatronics. She said that he hadn't, and all she knew was that his badge said Extraordinary Engineering on it. Then the Chuck E. Cheese animatronic at the center of the band pointed out at this husky lady. He opened his mouth and this deep moan emanated from him as he began to shake violently. It wasn't random though, it was like he was vibrating in a certain pattern and frequency. Then the woman left her kids and got up from her table. She meandered around the restaurant as Chucky started to point and laugh. We called the manager up to see what was going on, and when he came out, he was just as baffled as we were. Then the lady started screaming in horror, like she was watching a family member be murdered or something. That's the kind of intensity. The manager rushed forward and placed his hand on her back, trying to console her. But she suddenly turned and dove at him, biting and tearing flesh from his face, then chewing it up like melted cheese on a pizza. A large man from one of the tables rushed at her, tackling her to the ground. But she just grabbed him by the head and forcefully began to whisper into his ear. At first he didn't want to hear it and he struggled trying to get away. But she held firmly and eventually something clicked in his head. He looked at the front door and ran towards it, grabbing this huge wooden bench and sliding it in front so that the door couldn't open. We stood there, frozen in fear, as the man looked around the restaurant wide-eyed, breathing heavily. Kim and I took our chances and ran to the back office of the restaurant. He sprinted after us, but luckily we were able to get inside and lock the door. We immediately tried calling the cops from the office phone, but the line had been cut. Luckily, the manager kept an emergency cell phone at his desk, so we used that to call them. However, you know when you call 911, they're supposed to stay on the phone with you and everything? That's not what happened. After collecting some basic information, she asked us to describe the car of the man who worked on the animatronics. And when we told her, she fearfully said that authorities were on their way and hung up. We waited in the back office for at least a half hour, listening to the screams and cries of customers dying inside the restaurant, when we heard something sliding down from the outside of the building's walls. I unlocked the door and peeked out of the office very quietly to see what was going on outside. I saw that the outside windows were now covered with a yellow tarp, like we'd been quarantined inside. I called 911 again and was immediately handed off to an investigator who asked me to only speak when answering his questions. Then he said something that shook me to my core. We were not the only restaurant that this happened to that day. Apparently 3 other places with similar animatronics have been visited by the same man. The only thing is that with the others, several of the restaurant patrons had gotten out of the building and were shot by authorities. They also garnered that whatever the condition was, it was spread through speech patterns. Therefore, until they figured out for sure what was going on, they were not able to speak to us and we were not allowed out of the building. That was when one of the restaurant patrons started pounding on the office door. Eventually, after a few solid hits, an obese man bursted through the door into the office. He went straight for Kim, knocking her to the floor and bashing her head on the ground. I lunged at him, but he was surprisingly strong and quickly got control. Then he began whispering into my ear. He said, "Forget the future, forget the past. Life is over. Breathe your last." The way he said that phrase triggered something in me at a very deep level. My mind began to race, and somehow I began to understand at my core the insignificance of all beings. And it made me angry. It was an anger so strong I had never felt it before. It boiled up inside me and eventually became a scream. A scream so loud and intense that I tore my vocal cords. Then I don't remember anything after that. I woke up in a hospital, handcuffed to a rail on the bed. I knew something awful had happened, but the atrocities that I committed that night, I will never know. The official story is that I attacked Kim in a fit of rage and killed her. I knew that wasn't true though, and that's all I had to go on. God only knows what actually happened. Authorities were eventually able to contain the entire situation, and it was masked as an outbreak of some biological foodborne pathogen. Due to various corporate interests, it wasn't spoken much about in the news. These days, it would even be difficult to look it up anymore. As for me, I ended up in an institution. It's taken me years, but I think I'm almost at the point where my psychiatrist will approve for me to leave soon. The funny thing is, though, to be honest with you, nothing's changed about the way I think. I've pretended to be recovered for so many years that it's difficult to remember acting any other way. Ever since the moment that man whispered those words to me, all I've thought about was how to get out and spread the message to others. Now that I think about it, I may have already found a way. Hey, it's Mr. Freaky here. I hope you all enjoyed this original creepypasta. and that it made your hours in quarantine slightly more bearable, I wanted to remind everybody to please submit their original creations for the drawing contest before March 29th at 5 p.m. All the info about the contest is in the community tab. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do that, and please leave a like on this video for me. It really helps. Have a horrific evening, everyone, and remember to stay spooky, my friends.